Speaker.
Mr Speaker. Scott Simpson. Thank you, Mr Speaker. It seems slightly bizarre in a way that tonight here in the Parliament of New Zealand we are discussing an important matter of rates rebate for retirement village residents on a night that will go down in history around the world as being a night of political intrigue and interest to those of us who are tragic enough to be interested in such things. So, Mr Speaker, I wanted to thank the sponsor and proponent of this legislation, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, for bringing it to the House, because I do think it is an issue that the House should give consideration to. Sir, in my electorate of the Coromandel, I have the good fortune to represent an electorate that has the second largest number of people in the plus 65 age group of any electorate in the country. The electorate that has the most is the Otaki electorate, held by my friend and colleague, the Honourable Nathan Guy. And so in electorates like Otaki and in the Coromandel, we have large numbers of seniors who have chosen as a lifestyle residential choice a licence to occupy arrangement, usually in a retirement village, usually owned and managed by a private entity. And it's a model and a scheme that actually wasn't imagined or envisaged 40 years ago when the rates rebate legislation that this piece of legislation seeks to amend was actually first proposed. And so back in those days, 40 years ago, the concept of a licence to occupy literally didn't exist. And nowadays, for many people, this concept of a non-freehold occupancy of a unit or dwelling for which, as Ruth Dyson has said, they pay a not insubstantial amount of money, but technically and in terms of our land law system, they don't have a freehold title, and therefore by definition under the existing Rating Act they don't hold a rateable interest in terms of the title that they have. Now, Ruth Dyson made, I think, a fair point in acknowledging that in most of these licence to occupy villages, the people who are occupying those licensed premises actually do pay fees. I think it's a stretch too far to say that they pay rates, because legally and technically they don't pay rates, but the management of those organisations will invoice them on a regular basis for a range of costs that are associated with their care of the establishment, of the property, of the village. And that might include things like maintenance, gardening, sometimes it includes an element of insurance, and sometimes it will say rates. But that is not by legal definition an interpretation of rates in terms of the current legislation or the current statutory position that we find ourselves in. And the reason, as I say, that is not the case is because the primary principle legislation is 40 years old and simply didn't imagine a situation of the type that we have now. Now, sir, people who invest and buy into these licence to occupy homes are using a model that some people choose not to. And I know that there are sometimes family members, for instance, who say, well, look, if you buy into a licence to occupy as a resident in that sort of situation, then there is no potential for capital gain. You don't have a stake, and the occupier doesn't have a stake in the freehold of the property. And so, sir, this bill attempts, I think, with a degree of merit, to actually address a situation that has developed in a legal sense that has outstripped the existing principal legislation, as I say, 40 years ago. Now, I was delighted to see, sir, that some time ago, back in fact it was September of this year, the Minister for Local Government, Sam Lotuinga, made the point that he thought that for people who are living in these licence to occupy retirement villages, that the situation needed to be looked at. And so, sir, I'd agree with that, because I often, as a constituent MP, get people wanting to raise this very matter with me, as I'm sure do MPs from across the country and across the House, because for many people, the subtlety of the technicalities of our land law in terms of who is a ratepayer, who has title, and who is, in terms of the current legislation, the occupier and freehold owner of the land, is lost in the detail of the invoices that they regularly receive from the management company or organisation that administers the villages, when they see itemised regularly payments of a line on an invoice that says rates, even though technically it's not rates. So this is a bill that, upon first reading, I think is probably, well, in fact I know it to be, because I don't think that the Honourable Ruth Dyson would do anything other than bring to this House a well-intentioned piece of legislation, and I think that that's certainly the intent of her member's bill. But there are some problems with it, and on first glance it looks to me that, for instance, some of the matters that relate to where costs might lie, how the apportionment might work, and what are some of the technical details. This is, I think, a bill that, like many pieces of legislation, the devil is in the detail, and it will, I think, if it is to progress through the House to Select Committee, and I acknowledge that the sponsoring member has suggested and indicated that should it proceed past first reading, that she'd like to see it sent to the Local Government Environment Committee, and that would seem to me to be a very appropriate committee to send this bill to, because I think it falls neatly within the gambit of responsibility of that committee. But if it was to go to Select Committee, sir, I think that it would need some serious work in terms of the detail. For instance, there's absolutely no detail in the bill as it reads at the moment about how the scheme might be administered between the retirement village managers or owners and the local authorities, the territorial local authorities that operate in that area. And Ruth Dyson made, I think, a very good point at acknowledging that some territorial authorities, one of mine in my electorate, the Thames Coromandel District Council, is one, for instance, that has actually created a system, a scheme, whereby they can, under the Rating Act of 2002, adopt a way round, a work round, if you like. Now, that's not ideal, and it's not done in every territorial authority. So there are some parts of the country where, for instance, people living in licence to occupy residences don't have the benefit of a local council, district council, or that is prepared to make that kind of arrangement. But if this bill is to proceed, sir, then I think that there will be some detail that needs to be fleshed out, worked out, and probably some quite detailed analysis of the legal situation, because at the very basis of our land tenure ownership system is the indefeasibility of property in terms of freehold and the right to own and occupy land in such a way. And a licence to occupy simply doesn't meet that measure that is the very foundation of our land law that has been in place now for a very, very long time. And I'm not sure that the member introducing the bill would actually want to go as far as fundamentally undermining or changing the foundation stones and the basic principles of our land tenure law. But I do see and concede the point that she's making, because it is a point that many people have made to us as MPs. So on that basis, sir, and acknowledging that there are some issues with the bill that need remedying, I'm pleased to confirm that the National Party will be supporting this legislation to Select Committee, and we'll be working through it diligently at Select Committee, hoping to make it a better piece of legislation, and I give the member an absolute assurance that as Chair that will be the case. So I'm looking forward to having it at Select Committee and working it through. So just reiterating, sir, we will be supporting to Select